Hello and welcome to Digital Museum. Today's seminar session is on the Mughal responses to the plague, 1618 to 19. That's the Mughal responses to the plague in Agra. And it's with my guest, Dr. Mehrin Chidarazvi. And just to introduce you a little bit to the context of what this is about today, there's a book that is called Epidemic Urbanism, and it really is a response to the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment, that we've had 2 years of the COVID pandemic. And I think the idea for the book, Mehrin, was actually quite early on in 2020, wasn't it?
It was actually, yes. It was a very kind of early response to everything that happened when COVID kind of really came on the scene. And then the publication of it, the editors wanted it to be quite quick so that it was something which was still very relevant and current when it came out.
Yeah. And so the book, as the full title goes, Epidemic Urbanism, Contagious Disease in Global Cities. Now it's broken up into 4 sections and also a post-COVID epilogue as well. And as you've heard from Mehrin, and I'll introduce her properly in a bit, her actual paper is called Mughal Governance, Mobility and Responses to the Plague in Agra, India, 1618 to 19, and it's in the section on urban governance, politics and management. So Dr. Mehrin Chidarazvi, she's the research associate in the Department of History of Art and Archaeology at SOAS, that's the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, the Courtauld Institute of Art, the Vienna Sotheby's Institute of Art, and also at the University of Oxford and Morley College. Some of her publications, as well as the one that I mentioned for this book, that's Mughal Governance, Mobility and Responses to the Plague in Agra, India, 1618 to 19. She's also written papers called Power and Politics of Representation, Picturing Elite Women in Ilkhanid Painting, Chinikara in Safavid and Mughal Architecture, Resituating Mughal Architecture in the Persianate World, New Investigations and Analyses, The Perception of Reception, the Importance of Sir Thomas Roe at the Mughal Court of Jahangir, the Imperial Mughal Mausoleum of Jahangir, Homage and Legacy, and numerous other Mughal era investigations into art and architecture of the Mughal period. So Dr. Mehrin Chidarazvi, Mehrin, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And just to let everybody else, many of you have joined us numerous times as we too have been started in early 2020, and we've been doing these seminars for 2 years now. Many of you have joined us, but just to go over, please do put your questions in the Q&A. And if you have any conversations, the chat, please do put things in the chat, but please remember anything that you put in the chat, because the video is initially going to go on Zoom, it will be available to be seen by everybody that has a look at the video. So if you don't want people to see your chat, it's probably not the place to put it in. So just to say, Merin, thank you so much for joining us today. I get the feeling, Merin, I mean, you've studied a lot and you've investigated Mughal art, well, Islamic art in general, but Mughal era is something that you're very well known for. Would it be right in saying Jahangir is your sort of, you have quite a, if soft spot is probably, is he your favorite Mughal emperor?
I absolutely have a soft spot for him. He is. I find him. So my research area, my specific research area, is particularly on the arts, architecture, and material culture of Jahangir's reign. Although I do look at the periods before and after as well, but I find him to be just the most fascinating character. And what I find really, tantalizing about studying his reign and his era is just how much his personal nature affects the artistic production, the material cultural production. So there's a real, there's a real synthesis between what he wants and what we see in a way which we don't have that, I think, as strongly in other reigns and other areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. We can perhaps investigate some of that within the context of this topic a little bit later as well. You are dealing with the 1618 to 1619 during the reign of Jahangir, but as you mentioned in your case study that you did for the book, that there have been a number of outbreaks of epidemics during the Mughal period from 1526 onwards. How does his treatment, the policies that he takes, the decisions that he makes, how does that differ from earlier and also later periods? And what is there something that you notice that is distinctive?
It's a really great question, and it's one which I actually can't really answer, because the thing is that in terms of what we know about how the Mughal rulers and the societies responded to these kind of epidemics and these kind of pandemic occurrences, we don't actually know a lot in terms of what has been found in the written record. And what was so interesting for me about being able to research this particular topic is that the instances which I will mention today, but obviously what I focus on as well in the chapter, we just get these brief snippets of what Jahangir thinks is important in relation to these instances, which he mentions in his book. And then from that, we can draw certain conclusions.
Yeah, no, that is something that I was going to discuss with you further, really, how much we can trust his accounts, because a lot of it is from the Jahangirnama. How much can we trust his accounts of the conditions and also his priorities in relation to the rest of what's going on in the country, and how the population of Agra are suffering or not. So you've got a presentation for us. So perhaps we can share your presentation, and then we'll have a few more. We'll continue the conversation, and please do put your questions in the Q&A.
Let me first just say thank you, Javanisa, so much for the invitation to be here. I'm really delighted to be part of the fantastic lineup of speakers which you've had since starting. And thank you everybody for joining us today. And I hope you will forgive me for the fact that I'm going to talk a little bit outside of the 16, 18, 19 pandemic. I'll just give a little bit of information about some of the earlier ones as well. So I'm sure that many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the Mughals. But just to start by saying that the Mughal Empire, which encompassed much of the geographic area of South Asia, was one of the 3 Islamic empires of the early modern era, alongside the Safavids and the Ottomans. And you can see their situational relationship on this map. So across these empires, urban cosmopolitan centers and rural regions alike suffered from illnesses, disasters, and strife. So this short presentation is going to focus on how the 4th Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who reigned from 1605 to 1627, reacted and responded to occurrences of plague in his empire. And I'm restricting this talk to these instances because it is in the Jahangirnama, which are Jahangir's autobiographical, it's his autobiographical history, that we have these occurrences of plague mentioned. And each of the emperors had histories of their reigns produced, but these were for the most part official histories written by court historians. Only 2 of them were autobiographical, that of Babur, the founder of the empire, and that of Jahangir. And from the Baburname, we don't have any references to the plague or any kind of, widespread illnesses happening in South Asia in his memoirs, but there are a few mentions in Jahangir's. And this immediately frames the outbreaks he writes about in the context of what he himself considered to be important or of enough interest to note down. And so this allows us to have a singular opportunity to examine what Jahangir thought and how he personally reacted to these bouts of plague. From his memoirs and from accounts of European visitors to his court, it's evident that the plague broke out in the empire in 1615 to 16, and that reoccurrences would be seen during what they called the cold season for the next 8 years. And Jahangir doesn't reference each of these in his memoirs, only 3. Those that happened in 1615 to 16, 1617 to 18, 1818 to 19. And as I mentioned a little earlier, we have just very scant details of these epidemics and stories relating to them and their spread that Jahangir found of enough interest to actually write down. And so details that we would really be interested in are actually very lacking. But from what he does tell us, we're able to glean some information about urban interventions that were practiced and what, if any, governmental response was initiated, and if controls were put in place to help manage the spread of disease. And the disease was, because of the symptoms that he describes, we know that it was actually the bubonic plague, or its more serious progressive form, the septicemic plague. And if anybody's interested, I can go into the differences between those later on. The first instance of plague, which is mentioned in the Jahangirnama, takes place in the cold season of 1615 to 16. And it began in the sub-districts of the province of Lahore before spreading to the city of Lahore. And from there, it spread east, reaching Delhi and its surrounds, and from there going on to Agra and its surrounding areas. And it completely desolated the areas where it took hold. You can see in the map on the right that one of the main land routes of the empire was between Lahore and Delhi, and it went on from there to Agra. And this land route must have been key in the spread of the disease. This plague had such an effect in the city of Lahore that in a single house, between 10 and 20 people would die, and the neighbors would leave their homes in order to save themselves. We know also that the plague had spread to Agra, where the death rate was given as 1,000 people per day. A sense of the virulent nature of this bout of plague is garnered from letters written between members of the British East India Company, in which they're the ones who state that it's 1,000 people a day who are perishing at a minimum. From them, we're also made aware that in December 1615, and from them, sorry, I mean these letters, the East India Company agent who was in Agra decided to move to Fatehpur Sikri in order to escape the plague. So this account makes it clear that once the plague took hold, it spread very quickly. And we can deduce that while the origins were in the outlying districts of the Punjab, the explosion in the number of cases occurred once the plague caught hold in the provincial capital city of Lahore. The next mention of plague by Jahangir occurred in the cold season of 1617 to 18, and this time in Kashmir. In March 1618, he copied into his memoirs a report on this outbreak. The salient points he felt worth mentioning were how deadly the plague had been and the symptoms of the victims. He writes that on day 1, those who fell ill had a headache, fever, and bad nosebleeds, and on day 2, they died. It was also noted that if one person in a house got sick, the rest all succumbed as well, and that if anybody went near a sick person or a dead body, they too caught the plague. It's also made clear that the bacteria could be transferred from human to animal, and also from species to species. For one of the noted events in the report was of a dead body having been thrown onto grass, after which a passing cow ate from that patch of grass and subsequently died. And then dogs who ate parts of the dead cow themselves got ill, and then they also died. The report then went on to say that a fire happened to break out in the ward where the illness had begun, and it caused 3,000 houses to burn. We can draw from this that the epidemic took such strong hold of the population, in part due to the density of the space of origin, and no doubt the excessive density of the population therein. There's nothing written in the note to Jahangir to indicate that the fire was purposefully started in order to contain the spread, but there was definitely a correlation between the fire and case numbers, as there was a noted decrease in cases after the fire occurred. What is mentioned is that the fire was, it must have been the result of divine intervention in order for the plague to be halted. So of the 3 plague outbreaks that Jahangir mentions in his memoirs, it's the last one, that of 1618 to 19 in Agra, which directly affected him and the workings of his court. And Agra, you can see, is marked by the red star on the map. During Jahangir's reign, the city of Agra was heavily populated, on its way to being the largest in the empire in the 17th century. In 1609, the population was about 500,000, and between 1629 and 1643, it was estimated to be approximately 660,000 people. The population was concentrated their housing along the banks of the Yamuna River, but Jahangir writes that most of the population lived on the western side of the city, so they congregated on one bank of the river. And that part of the city had a perimeter of approximately 14 miles. He also references how densely built the urban area was, writing that most people have constructed 3- and 4-story buildings, and the congestion is so great that one can scarcely pass in the lanes and markets. The denseness of the city was also noted by European visitors to Agra, including the Portuguese factor Francisco Pelsaer, who was in Agra between 1621 and 1627. And he commented that the roads and the houses were built without a regular plan, and that the city was very large and had expanded rapidly due to the number of people building around the river. The urban density of Agra undoubtedly contributed to the rampant nature of the plague when it occurred there. And as described by Jahangir, this was an extremely virulent strand that passed between people and species with the slightest touch. So when this particular occurrence of the plague was happening, in early 1618, Jahangir and his court had been on the move from Malwa to Gujarat, with the intention of continuing on to the imperial capital city of Agra. They received word of the plague affecting Agra, however, and so Jahangir decided to wait in Gujarat, ensconcing himself in the court in the city of Ahmedabad in mid-April 2018, taking over the palace there. And you can see Ahmedabad marked by the green star on the map. He stayed there for about 6 months before leaving for Agra in the beginning of September 2018. When him and his retinue reached the environs of the city that had been founded by his father, Fatehpur Sikri, marked with the blue star, they reached in December. And there they were informed that the plague was again resurgent in Agra and its surrounds, and there was a death toll of approximately 100 people per day. And so once they heard this, Jahangir decided to stay at Fatehpur Sikri in the palace built there by his father until there was news of the plague abating in Agra. Now, Jahangir's ability to establish himself in Ahmedabad and then at Fatehpur Sikri, and to have at each place a fully functioning government, exemplifies one of the features of the Mughal court, that it was peripatetic and moved with the person of the emperor. It took, for example, approximately 2.5 months for Jahangir and his retinue to move from Ahmedabad to Fatehpur Sikri. And Jahangir had a fully functioning court this entire time, including, for example, all the accoutrements necessary to give audiences, create lavish palatial tented enclosures, account for ladies of the harem, and continue with the artistic production of the court. And this painting represents a royal audience scene occurring while Jahangir's court is on the move, which is evident through the depiction of red tent panels used to create a royal enclosure within which the audience takes place. Within it, a gold platform throne has been set up on which Jahangir sits, resting on the luxurious carpets laid down on the ground, and the multiple canopies of rich textiles which are raised above the emperor's head to denote the royal space. All of these accoutrements, plus the book being gifted, illustrate examples of items carried with the court when the emperor traveled within the empire. Jahangir's response to the plague occurring in his desired destination of Agra was to merely choose a different city to establish the court in, all the while carrying on with his daily rituals, ceremonial activities, and running of his government. It might be asked how this was accomplished. The makeup of the empire was such that it was divided into provinces administered by provincial governors, which were subdivided into smaller units called sarkars, each with their own local administrative official. Within each sarkar were further divisions into parganas, each of which was administered by a local agent whose primary job was revenue collection from the villages in their pargana. But despite this system of provincial and local administrative governance, it was the emperor who made all the administrative decisions in the empire, no matter where he was. As Jahangir himself writes, "In councils on state affairs and government, I usually act according to my own opinion and understanding." It was established practice that no important administrative decision would be taken without Jahangir being completely aware of it, even those that today would be considered too trivial for a figure such as the emperor. Such was that authority that he was able to, at a moment's notice, decide to move into a city with his entire court and administration and utilize it as his own for a period of months. While the plague had been resurgent in Agra and the area surrounding it, it did not spread any further west than the village of Amanabad, which was approximately 5 miles from Fatehpur Sikri. So in the area that I've blown up on the right side of the screen, you can imagine that Amanabad is in between Agra and Fatehpur Sikri, a little bit closer to Fatehpur. Fatehpur Sikri appears to have generally been a safe zone, free from arrival of the plague. So if you remember, I already mentioned that in December 1615, the East India Company agent in Agra moved to Fatehpur Sikri to escape the plague in the capital. This status of Fatehpur Sikri as a safe haven is likely because of the fact that the village of Amanabad and its surrounds had been completely abandoned, most probably due to the appearance of the plague there in the preceding years. And so effectively then there was a buffer area created between Agra and Fatehpur Sikri. The abandonment of houses, villages, and towns appears to have been one of the most effective methods for containing and dealing with the plague in Mughal South Asia. And removing any possible human vector was a recognized way of fighting such epidemics at the time. Muhammad Khan, in his Iqbalname Jahangiri, which is another history of Jahangir's reign, writes that when the plague broke out in 1616 in the Doab in the Punjab, if a family left the house immediately on seeing signs that it was coming and went away to the jungle, they would not succumb to the illness. So the implication being that they, physically picked up and left the area that was being affected. And so by doing so, they removed themselves from exposure. We're never actually told that cities were closed off in an attempt to arrest the spread of the disease during the epidemics of plague that harried Jahangir's empire. Jahangir does, however, make reference to an official being stationed to guard Agra while he's staying at Fatehpur Sikri, implying that there was regulation over who was permitted to enter and exit the city. It's clear, for example, that movements of the elite still occurred. Jahangir relates that his elderly mother, Maryam Zamani, came from Agra, which was a 2-day journey from Fatehpur Sikri, in early January 1619 to pay her respects. And that a few days later, another highborn lady and 2 courtiers came from the city and were granted audience with Jahangir. These occurrences make clear that movements of people between Fatehpur Sikri and Agra, where the plague was still active, occurred without seemingly any ill outcomes. But it's also apparent that those who were able to come and present themselves to Jahangir were of elite status and were permitted to make this journey and be given audience. The highborn lady who visited Jahangir from Agra reported to him her eyewitness account of the effects of the plague, and she insisted that they were true, but he found them so strange that he decided to write about them in the Jahangirnama. And the story which he was told was that this lady had seen a mouse in a courtyard acting strange, as if it were drunk. She told a maidservant to pick it up and throw it to the cat. The cat bit it, but then immediately dropped it, and then had a pained expression on its face. And the next day, the cat nearly died. The girl who picked up the mouse to throw it to the cat, she did catch the plague, and then she died, as did many others in the same house. Some of the people who were ill went out to the garden, where they perished, but from them, nobody else caught the illness. So this is the story which he's told about this one, housing unit, which was affected by the plague. And so from that, we can kind of gather that this group appears to have been either under a voluntary quarantine, or everybody was, being told to stay in their own individual housing units. Now, when we talk about how the plague then gets stopped, the notion of containing these breakouts of illness seems to have depended on the restriction of movements within cities and within the countryside as well. And this was likely due to the provincial geographical planning established during Akbar's reign. Pre-Mughal villages had been constructed approximately 3 kilometers apart. During Akbar's reign, Mughal towns were constructed as intermediate centers for trade, and the movement of agricultural produce within this framework of villages, and they were spaced approximately 25 to 30 kilometers apart. At the very center of these planned geographical systems were the provincial capitals. In the upper half of this painting that you see on the screen, we can see a visualization of such a spatial geographic arrangement, indicating the distances between villages and cities. It's also possible to gauge the urban density of the walled-in cities as opposed to smaller towns and villages interspersed in the countryside. Because transmission of the plague traveled along routes used by people of all classes and between villages, towns, and cities, the abandonment of these centers decreased the efficacy of the spread. The success of such evacuations and abandonments is clear from some of the activities Jahangir undertook while at Fatehpur Sikri. We're also told that he, and at times the women of the harem, would undertake hunting expeditions, including to the vicinity of Amanabad, the village which had been the limit of the spread of the plague. Hunting was not merely a sporting activity for the Mughal rulers. It was an activity tied up with the presentation of political power to one's subjects. So, for example, it was a way of showing political and military strength to the subjects of all classes, including those who might harbor thoughts of rebellion. It was a way of presenting to a population the ruler undertaking a royal activity. And so it was a way of reassuring the public that the ruler was active, watching over his empire, and by extension, his subjects. From the brief notes Jahangir makes on these three instances of epidemics in his empire, we are given information about the virulence of the plague, its transmission, even between humans and animals, and that movements of the elite classes was permitted and continued during these outbreaks. Whether this was also allowed by less fortunately circumstance, there's no word of. However, even if access to and exit from the gated cities was closely controlled, it's unlikely that there was no movement of the population in the rural areas. If nothing else, it would have been needed to maintain the necessary movement of goods and trade within the empire. And it is clear that despite the outbreaks, commerce and trade were ongoing. A letter dated 20th February 1619 lists the goods sent by the East India Company from Agra to Surat under the charge of one John Bangham. And this highlights that not only people, but material goods left the city when needed, despite the epidemic. So, to sum up, the complexities and difficulties of responses at the government level to pandemic situations is not a singular experience, but has occurred historically. And it seems that the reactions and movements of the affected population, particularly between rural and urban environments, has and continues to vary by social class. Although Jahangir informs us at the beginning of his memoirs that when he ascended to the throne, one of his decrees was that hospitals be built in large cities with physicians appointed to care for the sick, and that this was to be paid for out of revenue from royal lands. In his writings on the epidemics within the Jahangirnama, there's no mention of hospitals in use, doctors being called upon, or strict rules put in place to control the spread of the disease. Instead, we are given these little experiential vignettes of life during the plague. And more importantly for Jahangir, he makes it clear that the government continued to function, with him at the apex of the administrative structure, regardless of where he was, in a city or on the road, and that he was then kept updated of the plague occurrences and their severity. In order for that to happen, continuous movements of his administrators, messengers, and underlings needed to continue, and this was indeed the case. Also necessary was that the theater of the emperor and court continue as normal, projecting strength, competency, and control, ensuring that even in times of crisis, government and governance continued. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There's a number of things. I mean, you've mentioned that there's a lot of information that's missing that we might want to know about. Are there other sources that we could look at to fill those in?
To be completely honest, if there are, I don't know of them.
Okay. Yeah.
So
yeah.
I can't say more than that.
Okay. A lot of Mughal art has allegory, infusions of allegory in the symbolic use of various thematic elements. What about the writing? Are there sort of allusions to things? And I don't mean as in mystical writing or anything like that, but are there, how straightforward and transparent? And I don't mean in the sense of deliberately dishonest, but how Because when you write things, that you can put in flourishes that elevate the epic nature of your activities. So what are your thoughts about that?
It's a really interesting question. So I think the best way for me to answer that is to say that, we have these kind of two, and I'm talking specifically about the court histories of the emperors. We have these two, separate bodies of work. We have the autobiographies of Babur and Jahangir, and then we have the official court histories of Akbar, and then post Jahangir. Humayun's is written by Gulbuddin Begum, right? But when you have the court histories written by the official court historians, and the ones that I'm most familiar with are the Akbarname and the Padshahname, so the official court histories of Akbar and Shah Jahan. You have these histories which are written in order to extol the utmost magnificence of these people, who will occasionally, make a mistake, but even then it's kind of a sanctioned mistake or that kind of thing. These are very, whitewashed documents from that point of view. They are being created to project a very particular persona of the ruler.
I think you would expect that, but within that, there may be
you would. And what's so fascinating about the Baburname and the Jahangirname is that because these are autobiographical, that, I mean, obviously they're still written, to the histories of these rulers, and so there's a lot of power being projected in them, but they're also very honest. They're very real in a way that the other histories aren't. So you do get to see human flaws. You do get to see mistakes. You have Jahangir admitting to the fact that he's an alcoholic and an opium addict. You have Babur talking about his drunken nights out and falling in a river, this kind of thing. So
that also depends on what their feelings were about being drunk. I mean, for example, in today's society, people often say I'm not comparing it. Obviously, it's not like for like, but people will say things like, "Oh, I had such a fantastic night. I got, completely drunk. I was sick." That's a measure of what a good night it was. So I'm just wondering, because these were people who they weren't ultra Islamic followers of religion. They did drink, and they did have infusions of other religions that they incorporated in some of their ideas as well. So how did they feel? I mean, were they admitting to something that they felt shameful about when you say honesty, or was it something that would, within the context of their social milieu, would they see it as something that was okay?
That's actually a really, really complicated question. And not so straightforward to answer. So
would they have felt shame? That's what I'm wondering. If I mean, honesty comes from, if you're honest, if it's something that you're revealing that could cost you, that's a form of honesty. If it just shows you're a man or woman of the people, who are kind of the people that you see around you, in the same way as Boris Johnson would admit to things because he thinks that makes him look like, a man of the people, one of the lads, or whatever he wants to be at different times. If you don't feel shame, is it honesty, or is it just it's a different thing going on?
So I think that it very much, I think you have to, so if that's the kind of approach to how these events are given in these two autobiographies, you do have to take them very much on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
Because it depends on the circumstances of whatever activity it was, which led to, overindulgence or drunkenness or whatever. And it very much depends on what the particular circumstances of these things are. In terms of Jahangir and within the Jahangirnama, there is a recognition of the fact that he has a problem, because he gets very ill, and he knows he has to cut back in order to to get better. And he credits his wife Nur Jahan with being the one who incrementally kind of weans him down to a more respectable amount of alcohol today, a respectable number of opium pellets a day, this kind of thing. So it happens. It's just a fact of what his daily activities are. But there is a recognition that it had gotten to a point which is dangerous and not healthy anymore, and he has to step back from that. So this kind of raw truth, it does come across, which is fascinating to me.
No, that does sound interesting. Reading your case study, and also now you're talking about it, it seems that some of a lot of the policies that he was taking that we have access to was the fact that the preservation of his government and the strength of how it was portrayed was paramount. And so he both the government and also in a way the people, the solution was to be peripatetic. Was he also, because people were told to go out into the forest in order to get over the plague? So was it that the whole social response or social solution was to be to disperse from where you are?
Well, just to point out, just in the first instance, so the court wasn't peripatetic because of the plague. The court was just peripatetic in general. It moved continuously throughout the year from place to place, and it just so happens that for the 16, 18, 19, epidemic, he was on his way to Agra. I think it's one of these kind of light bulb moments where this kind of control, or the elements that you put in place to control something like this, it's a mixture of common sense and what people are observing, right? So there had been, 1615-16 wouldn't have been the first time, this had happened. So it had happened before, but just, we don't know about it from him or from the earlier records. But, you can imagine that there would have been lived memory, or things passed down about what to do, when something like this happens. So and then obviously as well, just that awareness where when you see your neighbors dying, it's a natural response to want to get as far away as possible, right? So it's hard to say what it was exactly which led to these kind of for example, like the families fleeing into the forest, when they see the first signs of the plague coming. It's self-preservation. But then when you have these wider, government systems put in place, so the idea of it wasn't just Jahangir keeping away from Agra, it was putting some sort of control around the city, but it was obviously still a very fluid, control. People were still coming and going, the goods were still moving in and out and on the roads. So I suppose it was one of these, we see it happening now. What is the toss-up between economy and life, in a way.
Yes, no, I mean, I think what I was really asking was, I think it's a natural response. If people are dying in a place, you want to run as far away from there as possible. But what I was wondering was there other signs of other solutions, because I guess what I'm really looking at is there's one thing, governments to show strength and show that the government is continuing, and that is important. But what about the other health measures? Were other things going on? It's beyond the taking advantage of the fact that the government itself was peripatetic to start with, and it just made it in a way facilitated the process of keeping going. But I just meant that it was the parallel solution for the people seemed to be also to move, to flee, to be mobile if necessary. And I'm just wondering what other things were beyond that, or is there anything that you might have read or seen?
Well, this is where we then get into the silence of the text, right? Because it's only these little small bits of information that we're given. So it's one of those things where, again, until somebody finds a text, if one exists, which has more information about this kind of these kind of occurrences, we don't know. I mean, I can't say more to that, unfortunately.
But they clearly had an idea of that, don't touch people. Did they have, I mean, you were talking about bubonic plague and septicemic plague. Did they have a notion of the difference and what caused it, or what not to do in the context of the two? If you saw these signs, don't do this, or if you see these other signs, don't, this is how you should behave.
Again, I mean, sorry, I keep coming back to it, but like we're not told, right? I mean, like we are given in the report, that Jahangir receives from Kashmir, I believe it's Kashmir, or the one from Lahore. It's one of the first two instances. He receives in his report, the fact that the people who are getting this illness, they have the buboes or buboes, whichever pronunciation it is. They're it's enlargements of the lymph glands. And people are presenting with those in the neck, in the underarm, in the groin. So it's this very normal presentation of bubonic plague. So we know that this is what is happening, and then we know that when it's not treated and the bacteria gets into the blood, you progress to septicemic plague, and then that's where people's skin gets blackened, and you have like much more awful symptoms. So we know that it's happening, but then in terms of control and what people do, I wish he would have made some mention, of these hospitals, which he mentions at the very beginning of his autobiography. But there's no mention, in relation to.
We need the diaries of a medical person.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you talked about how the countryside was reorganized under Akbar. I think it was under Akbar. You mentioned that the countryside was reorganized, and the villages were sited 25 kilometers apart, 25 to 30 kilometers apart, which is a greater distance. Was that in order to respond to previous plague outbreaks, or was it just what for other reasons they thought it was a good idea and it just happened to be quite useful?
I think with that, I don't think that was in a response to any kind of plague outbreaks or any kind of outbreaks of illness. I think that was part of the when you talk about a Mughal empire, it's really under Akbar that you have proper empire, right? So I think that that arrangement was a way of parceling and control of this very large geographic landmass, and it was a way then of having enough frequency of the mobile towns to oversee what's happening in the villages around them. Sure. So it's that kind of just this incredible network which was then created, which allowed for supervision and overview. And
I mean that's the impression I got, but I was just wondering whether it was also in response to whether the previous plague outbreaks were also a further response to it. But so you mentioned that the normal trade was still continuing. How normal were they? The levels of trade had that changed, or again, is that something that we just don't know? We just know that there was still trade going on.
Yeah, I think the latter. I mean, what would be really interesting would be to talk to historians who focus on the British East India Company, to see in the records, because they were copious record keepers, as well. What kind of impact these occurrences would have on their, on their books, on their activities, because the day-to-day, so you've got the international trade, but then obviously there's the internal trade and movements, and just the people with the bullock carts going to markets and that kind of thing on a regular basis, because everything in the cities, in terms of foodstuffs and breads and whatnot, like that's coming from the rural areas, and so all of that had to have been continuing, which probably contributed to the spread of the plague when these occurrences happened, because it would then be moving from place to place with infected people if they were moving along those routes also.
Yes. I was just really looking to see if there were records of any mention of those reducing, or what the consequences were, or anybody being prevented from movement or anything like that. But as you mentioned, that perhaps it would be interesting to look at the East India Company references to that. So one of the things, I mean, we are looking at, it's a lot of the times when you look at the history of medicine, and I know that your approach is not solely from it's more sort of governance and what does the art and the memoirs tell. But a lot of the times when you're looking at any history of medicine, or even in the contemporary context, it's not solely the containing the contagious agent or the obvious scientific medical response that's the only thing at play. There are sort of social ideas. There's often scapegoating. We saw worldwide early on during the pandemic talk of Chinese people being not very well treated in certain parts of the West because of the idea that it had originated from Wuhan. we've also seen that during outbreaks of bubonic plague in various parts of Europe, there was Jewish persecution and they were being scapegoated as having started the plague. Were there anything of that sort in the Mughal context? I don't mean persecution of Jews specifically. I just mean, were there people that were being blamed or scapegoated, or were there any, it was these people working in this sort of industry, or were there any scapegoating that it was these are the people to blame?
Nothing that I've come across. Nothing which I've been able, to deduce from, this information which we're given. There doesn't seem to have been anything like that which occurred.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Naomi puts a question. You've mentioned the East India Company a few times. She's asked about visiting foreigners who might have mentioned plague in India. Are there? I think Naomi's probably looking for particular references. Is there anybody in particular?
Gosh.
Don't worry, Naomi. If we can let you know later.
Yeah, because there's the East India Company references which I mentioned. There's so many European accounts of peoples whose time they spent in Mughal South Asia, and just thinking of these particular years. Yeah, I'd have to go back and check, because nothing is coming to mind. At the moment.
So actually Naomi mentions that Prophet Muhammad, and she's given a reference that talks about using Nigella, as we say, Kalajira, for health-giving properties. Yeah, it does. I don't know about it for bubonic plague, though. It's a great thing, and it's something that I love, and you can get oils now you can put in drink with your orange juice if you wanted to. But I wouldn't have thought it. I think it has other uses, really. But thanks for that link.
No, thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. And again, it's I can wish to high heaven that there was more information given in this text about things like what was given as a treatment, or did people have these kind of natural remedies, but unfortunately there's nothing there.
No, well, that's but as you say, we'll see if there was anything in the East India Company records that might shed some light. I think it's also, because if you look at, say, pre-Mughal period India, there's a lot of say the Vedic texts or Buddhist sutras that actually you can get a lot of information about medicine. Some of them are, and it's medicine kind of born out of religion and philosophy, but you can see that they're tinkering with ideas of hygiene and health and classifying certain things, and these you shouldn't do, and the idea that doctors were outcasts initially, and
Mm.
even things like the laws of Manu talk about, what punishment you should undergo if you welcome a doctor into your house.
Gosh.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm from a family of doctors, so I don't
No,
like the way
they
that's going.
accommodated. They later doctors were accommodated. You had to do some religious chanting and before they were allowed in. And I suppose it's because of
Goodness.
the sort of things that they handled.
Mm.
And so it's a sort of an indirect way of getting to some idea of ideas of being unclean and keeping your distance from these people who might have been unclean and might make you unwell. That's but you're saying that there is nothing that you've seen, and in a way it's probably not entirely fair, because your context is Islamic art. But I was just wondering.
Yeah, I was just about to say that I'm sure there must be some, medical texts and scientific texts from the Mughal period, from the Indo-Islamic, era before that, which would give information that I just don't know about, and I haven't seen. But
no, don't worry. It's just, we're probably just getting very excitable about
they're fascinating questions. They're really interesting questions.
You actually pointed out, you were talking about urban density. And this book itself is about epidemic urbanism, and obviously the population density, the closeness of people in spreading diseases, and the closeness of the people and animals, because you do get a lot of animal parasites that then convert themselves into becoming human parasites as well, and that's often the route that it takes. Now, you showed us some art. As an Islamic art historian, do you see certain things in the art, in paintings, that you can I don't mean directly to do with pandemics, but is there anything further that you can add from that perspective, from an architectural or an urban planning, that you see in in the art work that was produced at the time?
Sorry, anything I can see in relation to
any artistic depictions that say to you, aha, I can see of this period, these are parts that I can see. I mean, obviously they're not schematic drawings, but where you can see, well, actually I can see evidence of this because of this, as you say, the area looks quite dense, or not necessarily paintings of plague victims, but or if there is.
I mean, if there were, I would have put it in.
Yeah, I know you would. Yeah.
So, I mean, in a just a very broad answer, yes. I mean, that is what art history is. It's looking at the objects, the building, the painting, the canister, whatever it is, and seeing what those items tell us, about the history of a certain period. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can, look at there's so many paintings, for example, which have city scenes in them, or the construction of cities, and I contemplated putting one of them in, but then I thought it's getting a bit too much now. So it would lead me on a different tangent. But no, so you do, you have you have objects you can go to, you have items that you can go to, and it depends on what you're looking for. So in like the
Sure.
context of this particular
Mhm.
topic and this particular research, which is a very,
Very
you know,
specific, yeah.
very specific.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah.
very narrowly focused, right?
Mm.
You can, for example, find paintings which are supposed to be renditions of Agra. You can find paintings which have these, small cityscapes in them, where again you get this kind of dense nature of the city. So you look at these items and yes, appreciate them for their aesthetic qualities, which are fantastic, but it really is what can we learn
Yeah.
from them.
Mm.
And there were it would lead me down a whole other kind of research route, but if we start to look for material objects relating to healing, relating to treating the sick, you would, I'm sure that you'd be able
Yeah,
to
I mean, because you
find,
just, yeah,
like the canisters and the bowls and that kind of thing. So it's there, but I
yeah.
feel like that's a whole separate research project.
Yeah, no, it would be. It would be sort of like an archaeology
Yeah.
of archaeology of epidemic in
Mm.
Agra.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that would be a different area, and it would be a seminar on epidemics specifically,
Mm.
the nature of illness
Yeah.
in India. But so I think uh, as far as, because you cited Jahangir's leadership, that what does it tell about Jahangir's leadership?
Mm.
Can you really tell, apart from obviously he wanted to bolster his position, and that, I don't mean that in a as a frivolous thing, because
Mm.
obviously as the head of an empire, he does have to do that. But what do you think? Um, what do you think of his leadership within the context of managing the epidemic?
I mean, to be honest, not much. It's
Because I mean, if the government was, I mean, if the court was already peripatetic,
yeah,
and
exactly.
all
Yeah,
he did was he carried on and just
yeah,
stayed away for a bit longer and met his friends and admirers and went hunting.
yeah, yeah. No, this is the thing. It's everything would have carried on anyway, you know. And I mean, I'm being a bit like facetious when I say not much, but as you say, the court was peripatetic. It was a court that functioned on the move. It was very used to that. He'd been traveling, for months already, and staying in places for months at a time. Like he was in Malwa for what, 3-4 months before deciding to head back to Agra. So it is it's a administrative system which is structured to work anywhere.
Mm.
And so with this, then you just it's how you react to the extra chaos, of normal
Mm.
life, because it is, it is a big thing to handle, right? Because it does have um, economic impacts, it does have social impacts. And all of this is getting funneled back to him, right? It might not be that he's receiving, reports on a daily basis. It might be a weekly basis. It might be like a fortnightly basis. But it is ultimately coming back to him, and he is still the
Mm.
one ultimately having to decide if, there are decisions to be made, he's the one who has to make them, or he's the one who has to approve of the decisions which are being made in his name. All right, so it's not that he can just sit back and take it easy when all of this is happening, but it is the case that it's not disrupting his existence like it would be to the people who are being affected in this situation.
I guess I was really trying to get a sense of how inconvenience or how much extra stress the outbreak of yet another plague was to him as the head of an empire, if he was peripatetic anyway. And I mean, what are the decisions that he personally had to make?
Well, I mean, it completely depended on how close it came to him, right? Because the first two instances that he writes about, the first in Lahore, then coming down to Agra, and then the second one in Kashmir, it's a few lines just that this has happened, and an anecdote here and there, but it didn't get close to him. It didn't get close in a way that it affected his movements at all. It affected his day-to-days at all. Those were reports coming to him of something happening elsewhere. So he was aware of it, and he was obviously intrigued enough and interested enough that he wrote about it in his autobiography. But it's the 1618-19 one which directly affected his movements and where he was going to be, and had a much more personal impact on him from that point of view. So despite the fact that, like, yes, he can set up shop anywhere, and as we see, he did set up shop anywhere, it did directly impact what his plans were, and he did have to react to that, and he did have to maneuver around that. And and one of the things, like, I kind of wondered when I started or when I was working on this was, the fact that his elderly mother was in Agra as the plague is going on, and she leaves to come and see him. But just like when you try to think about those kind of like human elements of it as well, yes, he's an emperor, but that's his mom, in the middle of this, epidemic happening. So it's just the circumstances of it all are quite quite interesting, and it's what we can draw from and what we can deduce from just these little glimmers of insights we're given.
I mean, I'm expecting that everybody would be affected in a country, because if your movements are restricted, or access to produce and other things because of other people's movements being restricted, so he wouldn't have been untouched. But I guess what I'm sort of trying to get a picture, and it's possible that it's not possible to get the picture because it's not there, but just as what sort of because you're talking about things that affect him. So he mentioned the 1618 to 19, but even while far away, did he have to make decisions to tackle the spread of the plague at all, or was it just per urban area where there was a problem, some local governor was making the decisions of what to do? And because Agra was the capital, that was a different case.
Well, I mean, I think I think it would have been the latter. I think it was the case that, and it's also the situation, right? Decisions have to be made very quickly in these circumstances. So if you're talking about, a situation where the ruler is, like, it'll take a week to get a message to him, somebody on the ground there has to make those decisions about what's going to happen immediately to try to control this, thing, to try to contain this thing. And so, for example, the 1617 to 18, the example of the plague in Kashmir, he receives a report about what has happened, right? And it's from that report that he is then writing in the Jahangirnama. So what I deduce from that is that he's not been involved in that particular, reaction, in that particular,
outbreak.
Thank you. In that particular outbreak, and how to control that outbreak. But he is being constantly informed, and he's being made aware of what's happening, and finding it interesting enough to write about, but not having anything to do with it. Whereas with the situation in Agra, like, he sets up a guard, to keep watch on who's going in and out of the city. He is, traveling to an area right up, to the borders of where the plague has affected. It's a much more kind of real, visceral experience, even if he's not doing anything, in Agra. But there is more, I suppose, even if it's quite minimal, there's still an element of involvement, which I don't think is present in the earlier two examples. And that any involvement in those earlier examples doesn't come across in the text either. It's more of a reporting of this has happened.
If you mentioned from 1526 onwards, there have been several plagues, and I was just really trying to get a sense of whether they had a more generalized policy by then, by the time of Jahangir.
I presume so. I don't know, because Babur doesn't mention, any instances, but he's only there for just those few years. I don't believe that there are many, if any, mentions in the Akbarname. I would have to go back and check that, but if there is, again, it's just this like very little, it's just like these little droplets
mentions that it happened.
So the kind of awareness of how they reacted, what systems were in place, it's just not unknown to me.
No, I'm not suggesting that they wrote very detailed records of all the activities, but I was just wondering whether as a head, whether he was, by then there was some idea that his policies were such and such, and obviously regions would have they would have to make their own decisions within a policy, or whether it was more a case of things become so fractured during an epidemic of that scale that they all have to make completely autonomous decisions.
It's a very good question. I mean, so when he references that first instance, the 1615-16 plague, he does write that it's the first time this has appeared in the countryside, which seems to indicate that if that's true, it's in that early 17th century when we have these first instances of the plague, which I'm not quite sure how that's true, so I don't know if I believe it. But from his point of view, it's the first instance. But as I said, I feel like there had to have been some kind of I'm going to say institutional memory, even though that's not quite the right, word to use, in these cities and in these places, because there would have been presumably outbreaks of other illnesses as well, not just the plague, which happened from time to time. And how quickly people react, is necessary. It's really important. And no, I don't know where I'm going with that anymore. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but it's but it's true. I think I was looking at when you were writing about the fact that certain areas were abandoned, certain villages were abandoned in earlier times because of, and I think it was you mentioned it during Akbar's time, they were abandoned because of previous outbreaks. And so that's where I was wondering whether, because they have the memory, my father, during my father's time and my grandfather's time, there were several of these outbreaks. We remember there's all these villages that had been abandoned, the countryside where they were, as the trees have grown back through. I mean, I can have a visual imagination of what some of this takeovers by vegetation could look like. So if you've got memories of that having happened, and people do share stories and other other forms of communication that kind of saves these in the human memory. So I was just wondering whether some sort of centralized, sort of loose centralized policy had developed, but I guess that's requires more investigation, really.
Yeah, no, I can't really say anything to that. One of the things which is quite interesting, and this there was a question in the chat from Chandini, who is asking about if people thought the plague was an omen of God punishing them for choosing the wrong king because of the drama of Jahangir coming to the throne. So in the first instance, there wasn't too much drama with him coming to the throne. Him and Akbar were reconciled, before Akbar's death. And so Jahangir was, named by Akbar as his heir. There's then, the issue of Jahangir's son, Khusro, being a rebel. But no, so I wouldn't say that there was this idea about the plague being a punishment. But what's interesting is that, when you think of the political ideology of the Mughal rulers, and this idea that they are representative of being these perfect beings, and their perfection is representing the perfection of their empire, to have something like this happen is quite damning, right? And there's obviously no way they're going to take responsibility on themselves for that. So there is this tie-in with supernatural events or divine interact, like sorry, my brain's shutting down again. Intercession. Intercession. So with that fire, which happens in Kashmir, there's the idea that it was divinely ordained so that the plague could be controlled and be halted. And there's another reference made to, is it a water spout or some kind of like vortex in the air, which became a signifier of the 8 years of plague that followed. So it's like a supernatural event which became like a harbinger of, oh, this is happening. So it had nothing to do with the polity or the rulership of the ruler. It was these external forces. And so then Jahangir is left as the one who has to conquer that and control that. But he's well up to that challenge, right? But it's something else which brings this, these occurrences to the empire.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this idea of divine right of kings. His obviously he's the emperor, but you have the notion of the divine right to rule, because they've also got an idea of them being descended from a sort of immaculate conception, descended from a line of immaculate conceptions. Now, does that affect at all, do you believe, the way they would have tackled outbreaks of plague, their sort of idea of having this divinely ordained right to rule?
No, I don't think that impacted how they handled these kind of occurrences. The idea of being divinely, ordained to rule, that it was their divine right to be on the throne. It plays into so much of their imperial ideology and gets projected so much in the arts and the architecture and the material culture. But in terms of, something like this, controlling an outbreak, and being able to handle it, and to that, I don't think it comes into that. I think then you're talking just more about just the practicalities of how to keep a city from becoming decimated, to how to stop a village from being abandoned, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So there wasn't a greater pressure and expectation that these almost supernatural leaders are going to are going to perform enormous miracles.
No, there was never, so with the Mughals, there was never this idea that they were capable of performing miracles, or having that kind of supernatural ability themselves. So it was this idea that they are from this, line, and they are imbued with this, divine grace, but not that they have divine power.
Yeah, no, supernatural was probably not the most suitable word to use here, but as in they were so, because of their divine right to rule, their extreme power and greater prowess and abilities, that they will be able to get the people through this and overcome whatever adversity that the empire was facing. It's from that perspective I was really asking. So you had outbreaks in Agra, and they were terrible. How aware would much of the other places have been that there was an outbreak in Agra and a few other places? If I was a village in, much further to the west, beyond Fatehpur Sikri, much further to the west, would I have been aware?
Possibly, because you have you have this consistent movement of messengers, going throughout the empire, right? Jahangir finds out about the plague in Agra while he is in Malwa, bordering Gujarat. That sent him to Ahmedabad. Then he leaves there and starts heading towards Agra, and then he finds out closer to Fatehpur Sikri the plague is rampant again. So I think that you do have the possibility for people to know that this is happening is there. Whether they do or not is going to depend, on which village that messenger stops in and what he says and who he talks to. So it's, but I think that there would have been an awareness for the people who could be affected, because if you are transporting goods, you are not going to be going to a place where as far as you can avoid it, where the plague is. If you are going to be going on like a week-long excursion to, for example, Amanabad, then you get there and the city's been abandoned or the town's been abandoned, there would have been systems in place for people to be aware of what was going on if it was necessary for them to be aware, I suppose, is the way of
yeah. I mean, obviously Jahangir would know. It's because of his position, and there would be officials and other people, and as you say, if they're transporting food, but as far as because today Fatehpur Sikri is not very far from Agra, and it's, I would have imagined the people living in Fatehpur Sikri would be very well aware that Agra, that there was that there was a plague outbreak in Agra.
Yeah.
But beyond that, as you get further west, I'm just wondering how much people who are not high-level officials or having to travel great distances, how much they would actually be aware, how much conversation there was about, would they be aware that now is a period that they need to be careful?
Yeah, well, that's when I come back to the phrase, the possibility of them knowing, I think, is there. I don't think these were occurrences which remained isolated. I don't think it would have been at all the case that to keep people from panicking, like they tried to keep this news close, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't have imagined that.
Yeah,
but
so I think that it, I think the possibility of people knowing would have been there.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you for we've had quite a few links from Naomi. Thank you, Naomi. We'll have a look at those randomized trials and various other things. And thank you, everybody. I'm a fan too. So thank you for joining us.
No, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And what are you going to be doing any more on epidemic related, or is this?
I have quite a few. I have quite a few items on a backlog of projects which I need to get on with. And no, I can't say that working on epidemics is one of those. But it's been so interesting to do it, and so so relevant to, obviously, to what's been going on. And if anything, the collection, the book that you showed, it's been fascinating to be reminded of how long these kind of things have been going on for. And it just makes you think that, God, all these lessons which should have been learned, weren't. And so we're going through everything that we're going through now. But it is something which I would like to come back to. I'm really intrigued by the idea of hospitals in Mughal cities and where they were and what have any been properly identified, because you think of some of the other kind of major major empires, like the Mamluks come to mind first for me, and we know they constructed these great hospitals. We know where some of them were. We know that they were vast. Jahangir tells us that he, ordered hospitals to be built, and where are they? It's an interesting question to me, which is something I might want to come back to.
No, that would be fascinating. I think with looking at previous outbreaks of epidemics is fascinating from a number of perspectives. And I've many years ago read a lot on sort of letters of a lot of people who were isolated in Florence during outbreaks of plague and things like that. And it is fascinating to look at some of the restrictions and other things that people have to put up with, and also the social thing and the scapegoating, for example. So I think I would definitely be interested to know about some of the social dynamics in India, because I'm calling it medicine, but I think medicine and dealing with diseases and our understanding of health and epidemic issues are actually so closely allied to ideas of philosophy and religion and social dynamics, and in this case, governance and architecture and urbanism, that it is really fascinating. So thanks for sharing one of the case studies.
My pleasure.
Hopefully have you back for something more art,
I'd love to.
art related, which is your closer to your heart. So I think that would be great to have you back.
I would love to do that, and I would be able to answer more of the questions properly then.
No, you were great. So thank you. So everybody, in the UK, it's now afternoon. Wherever you are in the world, whether it's evening or afternoon or even morning. So have a wonderful rest of the day and have a good weekend. Okay, thank you very much.